I'd like to explain why we think the defense of the Detroit Institute of Arts, along with other museums, libraries, cultural institutions, and the right of the working class to have access to culture are so important. Since last May, as part of the effort to drive Detroit into bankruptcy, to loot the city of all its valuable assets, and to place the whole burden of the financial crisis on the back of the working class, the DIA has been under almost constant threat. Emergency manager Kevin Orr and his colleagues, supported by Republican state and city politicians and the unions, have repeated many times that selling the art in the DIA is on the table to help pay the city's debts to the wealthy creditors. And as the previous speaker said, of course, this is entirely illegal, but that's not the subject of my discussion. In August, the emergency manager hired the New York-based auction house Christie's, one of the biggest, two biggest art auction houses in the world, to begin putting price tags on works that were bought directly by the city of Detroit. Christie's issued its report in mid-December. It appraised 1,741 works bought by the city of Detroit from the 1920s through the early 1950s and put their market value at between $450 million and $870 million. The art market, which hit record highs last year, is drooling over many of these works. Most recently, the DIA has been forced by Governor Rick Snyder, Judges Stephen Rhodes and Gerald Rosen, and Orr, to accept the so-called grand bargain under which the museum will have to come up with a $100 million contribution over 20 years. Also, the DIA is to be placed under the control of an independent nonprofit. It will no longer be a city-owned museum, which it has been for 95 years. We completely reject and oppose this deal, which involves squeezing money out of the DIA and slashing the pensions of retirees, all for the benefit of banks and bondholders. This grand bargain is a compromise only in the sense that if you give a thief 9/10 of what he demands, that's a compromise. The rotten agreement raises many issues in relation to the DIA. First, the DIA officials would only have agreed to make the $100 million payout, or the promise of a payout, at gunpoint, so to speak. The politicians and Orr no doubt threatened the DIA that the alternative was selling off important artworks, which would mean the end of the DIA as a serious art museum, or even its closure. Second, the $100 million demand is entirely unjustified. The museum is not responsible for the economic crisis and the debts run up by the crooks who run the city. Third, it will be almost impossible for the museum to raise that sum. The deal may very well drive the museum into bankruptcy anyway. The DIA has difficulty meeting its bills at the moment. The burden may well force it to sell art, if not this year, then sometime in the future. The deal has resolved absolutely nothing in terms of the security of the museum. Fourth, the end of the DIA as a public museum has major implications. The super rich who run America hate the idea that the people of Detroit think they own the museum and have the right to access to the artwork. In the opinion of the very rich, everything of value in society should be owned and controlled by them, the 1% or the fraction of 1% at the top of society. In one way or another, this wealthy elite wants to get its hands on the artwork in the DIA. They think it's ridiculous and ludicrous and insulting that a worker and his or her family can walk into the museum and find themselves in half a minute in front of Vincent van Gogh's self-portrait, for example, or the Diego Rivera murals. In the end, the super rich would like to possess this painting, the Van Gogh painting, for example, which is currently valued at between $80 million and $150 million, which was purchased for $3,700 in the 1920s, and others, which have been off the market for nearly a century, and put it in their homes or private museums as an investment and as a status symbol. It would make them feel like kings. In fact, many of the great works in the museum were bought with public funds, and in the United States, that is highly, highly unusual. Between 1922 and 1930, when the Great Depression hit, and to a lesser extent between 1945 and 1953, the DIA bought many great works of art with money allocated to it by the city of Detroit. It was part of the Detroit city budget. To use public money for art was almost unheard of among American museums then or now. It's a remarkable and distinctive and creditable feature of Detroit's history, and it has a great deal to do with the presence of the industrial working class. It's therefore doubly and triply illegitimate that these works should now fall into the hands of multi-billion-dollar foundations run by major corporations, much less be sold off to billionaire investors. Whatever the politicians and museum officials say now, the privatization of the museum will end up making the artwork less accessible or inaccessible to the public. If they succeed, the example of the DIA will help pave the way across this country and around the world, for that matter, for the return of conditions when kings and queens and aristocrats and top church officials commissioned and owned all the major artwork, bought and sold it, showed it, or kept it to themselves as they pleased, and the broad masses of the people were kept as ignorant and illiterate and as submissive as possible. This is the situation that existed in Europe until the late 18th century, when important royal or princely collections were made public in France, Italy, and Germany. Yes, King Louis XIV, whose dates you see, commissioned 300 formal portraits of himself, flattering or otherwise as you see fit. As he was age 60 at this point, he made his legs apparently very youthful. Or he had his painter make his legs. He was also the chief patron of the arts. With the return of the aristocracy to America, are we now going to have artistic celebrations of these new billionaire aristocrats? The rich everywhere want to get their hands on great art for money and prestige reasons, but they are also deeply hostile and opposed to workers looking at art and thinking about it. Art broadens people, makes them more aware of the way the world is, the way people are. Art encourages people to be imaginative and more open and discontented with their oppression and poverty. Art, from the point of view of the elite, is dangerous. It's well known that under slavery, before the Civil War in the US, teaching a slave to read was a criminal offense because a slave who could read was a dangerous human being. And it may be worth reading this. This is the law in South Carolina. Whereas having slaves taught to write or suffering them to be employed in writing may be attended with great inconveniences, be it enacted that all and every person and persons whatsoever who shall hereafter teach or cause any slave or slaves to be taught to write, or shall use or employ any slave as a scribe in any manner of writing whatsoever, hereafter taught to write, every such person or persons shall, for every such offense, forfeit the sum of 100 pounds current money, pounds being the currency of the time. Today, under capitalism, a worker who reads the wrong, that is, socialist books, or websites, a worker who looks at and thinks about art is dangerous. There are no laws against it on the books, but in practice, the ruling elite makes it as difficult as possible for workers to develop themselves culturally and intellectually. And as we well know, the ubiquitous National Security Agency uses technology to find out what people are reading and what they are thinking. We do everything in our power, on the other hand, to promote interest in art and literature in the working class. This is the tradition of the socialist movement all over the world. We fight to defend and improve the economic position of the working class, but we also recognize, in the memorable words of the Gospel of St. Matthew, that man does not live by bread alone, and that a working class movement worthy of the name has to be broad, deep, cultured, and sensitive to the entire human condition. Being able to fight, prepare for, and defeat all our enemies in the corporations, the government, the trade unions means that we need a movement of the most advanced thinking and feeling. And I include the unions in that group of enemies of the working class for a reason. Specifically in the Detroit crisis and in every other attack on the working class, the unions are on the other side of the fence, accomplices of the governments and the companies. Since last summer, the unions in Detroit have been among the strongest advocates of selling the artwork of the DIA, supposedly to defend pensions, in reality to get a portion of the spoils for themselves. We asked Ed McNeil from ASME, Larry did, the biggest union among the city workers, whether he was in favor of selling the art, and he said memorably, "Of course, you can't eat art." This is pig ignorance combined with political reaction. The record of McNeil and the AFSCME, of course, is one of sellout after sellout. They offered $180 million in concessions, which was turned down. The city unions have seen the municipal workforce drop from 18,000 to less than 10,000 without lifting a finger. If McNeil and company have their way, yes, workers won't be eating art and they won't be eating anything else either. Same goes for the UAW, which occasionally stages stunts at the DIA. But what's the record? They supported Benny Napoleon in the elections, the businessman with a badge, who was outspoken about his contempt for the museum, and when it came to the city's assets, Napoleon proclaimed, "I think they should take the DIA first." King of the UAW, McNeil, and their associates are enemies of the working class, and their contempt for art and culture proves it. I'll get back to this issue of pensions versus art in a second. I just want to speak briefly about the history of the museum and its relationship to the working class in Detroit. It is an unusual museum with a highly unusual history. The museum was founded in 1885. That building was destroyed, I think, in 1970 to build a highway, by wealthy individuals in the newspaper industry and others. At that time, after the American Civil War, when support for equality and democracy were strong in official circles, even among some of the big business people, a series of art and science museums, as well as public library systems, were established in the U.S. This is the series, you can tell, 1870 to 1885, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Cincinnati, and Detroit. In part, of course, the rich had their own self-interest in mind. They needed a more educated population to work in industry and offices. They also wanted to incorporate the many immigrant workers who often tended to be socialists into American life and convince them that America was a land of opportunity and democracy. They also believed in education at the time as a principle. This was considered a solution to many problems. The Detroit Museum was turned over to the city in 1919 because private funding was inadequate, and now named the Detroit Institute of Arts, became a department of the city of Detroit. This is very unusual in the history of art museums in the US, as I said. In the 1920s, during the boom in the auto industry and the massive growth of the city's population, the museum received adequate funding from the city and many great works of art were purchased. I want to say a few words about the director of the museum at the time, a man named Wilhelm Valentiner. He was born in Germany and trained by the greatest museum organizers of the time in Berlin. He came to America before World War I, then went back to Germany, served in the German military in the war. At the end of the First War, a revolution brought down the emperor in Germany, the Kaiser, and the working class threatened to take power in its own hands. The Russian Revolution had just taken place. In the end, the German workers were betrayed and capitalism survived. But Wilhelm Valentiner participated in the revolution and attempted to organize artists for the cause of artistic and social change. After he became director of the DIA in 1924, a job he held until 1945, he worked with the Ford family and many rich families, many rich individuals. But he had ideas, certain ideas about art that never changed. He believed, as he wrote, these are his words, that art could attain greatness only by contact with the suffering masses and by drawing spiritual sustenance from their tragic experiences. He also believed that the most important art arises from greater depths and embodies the broad masses of the people. When someone tells you this is an elite institution, you can tell them this. Valentina bought many beautiful works, including the ones that the emergency manager attempted to use this year as bargaining chips. Sorry, that's the other quote from him. This, of course, is the most valued monetarily painting in the DIA by The Wedding Dance by Bruegel, done in 1566. He lived in what is today Belgium and painted the common people of his time, which was highly unusual. Most artists painted aristocrats or mythological scenes or religious figures. He painted peasants. Painting is today worth between $100 million and $200 million. It was purchased for $37,000. He also bought the Van Gogh self-portrait that I showed. And Van Gogh, of course, also painted the common people, postmen, peasants, bar owners. And Van Gogh hated the people who made money out of art. Valentina also bought remarkable African art. This is a portrait of a queen mother from Nigeria, which is worth in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the ivory case there from the Congo or Angola, which is worth $1 million. The DIA was also the first museum to have a section devoted to Native American art and the pre-European art of the Western Hemisphere. Now, in 1931, Valentina hired Diego Rivera, the Mexican artist and socialist, to paint murals in the DIA courtyard. This was during the Depression, when people were suffering horribly. In fact, I believe that the month that the murals actually opened to the public was the highest unemployment of the whole Depression period. And millions of people, of course, were turning against capitalism. Rivera came to Detroit because he was fascinated by the auto industry and because he believed the working class was the central force in society. Major protests had begun against the starvation conditions by the time he arrived. He studied the auto plants and made hundreds of detailed drawings. Then he began to paint his murals, which took him months, sometimes 18 hours a day. The Detroit Industry Mural, in my opinion, is one of the world's great works of art, certainly one of, if not the greatest work of art of the 20th century. The murals, this of course is just a tiny details. The murals show the process of making a car from beginning to end and place the auto workers at the center of the picture, but they also depict nature, the origins of humanity and society, the relationship between humanity and nature, the role of science and technology, both positive and negative. This is a unique work. Rivera and Valentina came under violent attack from right-wing forces in Detroit while the murals were being painted in 1932. A number of Catholic and Protestant clergy, newspaper editorialists, wealthy men and women, all sorts of reactionary elements came together in their hostility to these murals. They called them ugly, vulgar, atheistic, distasteful, pornographic, communistic. Much of the elite in Detroit was insulted because the auto workers were in the forefront and not they. Incidentally, 10,000 people visited the museum on the first day it was open. The murals were open, 70,000 to 100,000 within the month. In my opinion, sections of the Detroit elite never forgave the DIA and Valentina for hiring Rivera to paint these murals. Never. There were those at the time who demanded they be painted over or destroyed, and there are many who still feel that way. It's my belief that one of the reasons the museum has not been strongly supported by many of the wealthy, and why the DIA has always been one of the poorest museums in America in terms of big donations, or in terms of its endowment, is because of these murals which champion the working class. The museum in Detroit is unlike any other from this point of view. It has in its central courtyard a tribute to the working class in the form of these murals, which themselves reflect and are a product of big social struggles in Detroit, and which have always been very popular with auto workers and other workers. This courtyard says something important about the reality of modern society, about capitalism, and this is very, very unusual. Valentina and his very skilled staff built the museum collection through enormous effort and self-sacrifice. They did it for the people of the city of Detroit, using the money of the people of the city of Detroit. They intended the art to be accessible to everyone, As Valentina said at the time of the current building's opening in 1927, rich and poor, high and low. The museum has always been on shaky financial grounds. It almost closed in the 19-teens before the city took it over. It closed its doors briefly in 1932 during the Depression, when the city cut its budget to the bone and most of the staff were laid off. In 1975, under Mayor Coleman Young, as the crisis of the auto industry hit, the museum closed its doors for 3 weeks. In 1991, the state of Michigan slashed its funds to the DIA. The museum now receives no state money whatsoever. In 1998, the city handed over responsibility for day-to-day operation to a private group. And now, the many years of effort to build up a museum, the possibility of future generations being able to view the artwork is threatened so that Wall Street and the others can get their blood money. We have been fighting since last May against the attack on the DIA. No one has a record like the World Socialist Web Site and the Socialist Equality Party on this question. In October, of course, we organized the first and only serious protest to date against the attack on the DIA and the other elements of the attack. The emergency manager and his accomplices, along with the media, used the argument then, and they use it now, that keeping the DIA's art collection had to be weighed against the pensions and benefits of the city workers. We said last May that such an argument was cynical and contemptible. We said that if the authorities in Detroit had their way, Detroit residents would not have either safe streets, public services and jobs, or a significant art museum. While the creditors, lawyers, politicians, art vultures, and consultants would walk away with tens of millions of dollars. A group of local demagogues, politicians, and ministers has argued that, and I quote from one here, to place a chokehold on seniors' pensions while protecting art at the DIA is wrong, end of quote. This is a big lie, an absolute and utter lie. And it usually goes along with attempts to promote social backwardness and often racialism. What prevents the museum from having both a major museum and decent pensions and benefits? These demagogues never attack the billionaires who are robbing everyone. They always attempt to pit one need against another, as though the present situation was some natural occurrence, like a hurricane or an earthquake. It's not. It's the product of capitalism and the profit system and its priorities. It's entirely phony to argue that the population can have either art or pensions, but not both. First of all, the history of the DIA and the history of struggles by the working class prove that attacks on the museum, threats to existence, have always gone hand in hand with attacks on the working population. This is what happened in the 1930s and 1970s when the museum had to close its doors temporarily. The population wasn't spared when the museum was attacked. The working class didn't get any advantage from the museum's near bankruptcy, and the museum hasn't benefited from the attacks on the working class. In fact, the economic and cultural conditions of the working class are bound up together. When the workers fight, they make both economic and cultural gains. When they are prevented from fighting or their struggles are betrayed, they lose economically and culturally. A ruling class that proposes to destroy a public art museum will not hesitate to destroy everything the working class has: its jobs, its pensions, its schools. There's more than enough money around to support an art museum open to the public free of charge 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. We're not simply defending the way the present museum is organized and run. The working class is deprived of culture, and that's not simply a matter of hours and admission fees. Genuine access requires knowledge and education, which is incompatible with a crisis-ridden system. The DIA and every art museum should be expanded. There should be branches of the museum in working class neighborhoods, an idea that actually was proposed in Detroit in 1919, but never carried out. Whether that was the inspiration of the Russian Revolution, I don't know. There should be billions spent on arts and music education in the public schools. There should be vast sums spent on encouraging younger artists who are unable to make a living or forced to do rubbish. A new generation of artists will have a different attitude toward capitalism, a far more critical attitude. The working class has the right to culture and art, along with the right to decent jobs, education, health care, housing. We're not begging anyone for these things. Nothing has been won without struggle. In our view, in conclusion, The DIA can only be defended on the basis of a political struggle against the present social system. Its fate cannot depend on the generosity of billionaires or their plans and whims. The museum should be publicly owned, publicly run, publicly planned, and organized. The art belongs to the people, not the rich.